I am Dr. Vinita Bhadoria, Associate Professor of English in Government College, Behror. Welcome in this video on the poetess Kamla Das and her poetry, My Grandmother's House. This poem is prescribed in the BA Part 2, Paper 1. Kamla Das is one of a few significant poets writing in English. She made an instant appeal when her first collection, Summer in Calcutta, came out in 1965. The compelling originality and freshness of approach of themes such as marriage, sex, and love is the most striking aspects of her poetry. She writes about herself in the confessional mode like Robert Loyal and Sylvia Plath. She expresses herself without inhibition in a direct, poignant, and colloquial manner. Her moods, her love, her marriage, her grandmother, and the cities in which she lived from the subject matter of her poems. There is an intimacy with the reader of a spontaneous acceptance of life and its happening in a way not seen before in Indian poems. From the legendary, sentimentalized India of the pre independence poets, a shift is made in her poetry to a more social, independence poet, more social, contemporary, localized, and personal India, as can be seen from the title of her poems. Little introduction, a brief introduction of the poem. My Grandmother's House was first published in the first anthology of poetry titled Summer in Calcutta in 1965, written by Kamla Das. A major preoccupation of Kamla Das is a retreat into the past, which also becomes a symbolic retreat in the realms of innocence, simplicity, and purity, juxtaposed against her need for love, her sense for urgency, her sense of loss and deprivation, and a keen sense of nostalgia. The poem My Grandmother's House is a reminiscent poem. It is written in the form of a dramatic monologue. The speaker here is Kamla Das herself. She seems to be talking to her husband. He says nothing in the poem. Thus, in the form, this poem, My Grandmother's House, resembles the dramatic monologues written by Robert Browning. It is a short poem of 16 lines and may also be called a dramatic lyric. There is no rhyme scheme. The poetess is in her room, away from her grandmother's house. She recalls the house where she lived as a small child, loved by her grandmother. When her grandmother died, she left the house. Her grandmother's house is now deserted and closed. It is dark inside and she cannot see anything in the room. She thinks of bringing darkness from there and putting it in her bedroom. She is in a thoughtful mood. She seeks love at a stranger's door and is ready to accept even a small love got from any stranger. The poem expresses the nostalgic mood of the poetess, that is, a feeling of sadness mixed with pleasure and affection when she thought of her happy time in her grandmother's house. It is also an autobiographical poem in which the poet's longing for her parental house in Malabar is movingly described. She is reminded of the ancestral house where she had received immense love and affection from her grandmother. The poet's feminine sensibility finds its clearest loveless relationships in it. A note of pessimism runs throughout the action of the poem. The poetess got love from her grandmother in her girlhood. Now she yearns for love and begs it even from strangers, but fails to get it. She is hungry of love. Unfortunately, nobody fills her heart with the life nourishing emotion of love. It reveals the poet's painful, unfulfilled desire to visit her grandmother's house, to which she is deeply and emotionally attached. The poet is shocked to learn that the house is all in ruin after the death of her grandmother. The poetess passionately yearns to go to the great house and to look once again through its windows, which are blind. The house is now entirely deserted, and no one can look through the windows. She longs to sit there by herself and to listen to the dreary music of blowing cold winter winds, which would revive memories of her dear dead grandmother. She wants to articulate her intense grief once again. A death like silence reigns in her grandmother's house. She has also used suggestive visual imageries such as blind eyes of the windows, not opened windows, and the frozen air to convey the idea of death and desperation. The poem is a symbolic retreat for the poetess to a world of innocence, purity, love, and simplicity from a world of corruption, sterility, exploitation, and cunningness. It is a sanctuary of love, which is conspicuous by its absence in the harsh word of reality. Unfortunately, nobody fills her heart with the life nourishing emotion of love. Moreover, the intensity of her grief is suggestively conveyed by the ellipses in the form of a few dots in this section of the poem, in the sections of the poem. It was her disenchantment with her loveless marriage which reminded her of her grandmother's pure and selfless love. Now I am going to explain the poem to you. First, I'll recite the poem. There is a house now far away where once I received love. That women died, the house withdrew into silence. Snakes moved. Among books, I was then too young to read, and my blood turned cold like the moon. There is a house is grandmother's house. So the poetess is lying in her bedroom and recalling her grandmother's house where she once lived with her. Her grandmother loved her very much. She is now dead. That woman died. That means her grandmother is dead now. The house withdrew into silence. And there is no one in the house. House means grandmother's house. Snakes moved. Snakes are the reptile. Among books, I was then too young. On the books, there are so many books, and the reptiles moved on because they are deserted. To read, and my blood turned cold like the moon. There were books in the house, reptiles could be seen there. She was at that time very young to read the books. She could not read or write. When her grandmother died, it seemed to her that she had lost her capacity to feel. The blood in her veins seemed to have turned cold. In these lines, the poetess shows the intense love and attachment to it, to the grandmother's house. She suffers from an acute sense of alienation after having left this place after her marriage. The poet now lives in a big city after her marriage, a remote place. From her grandmother's house, she is reminded of her grandmother's house where she spent her memorable childhood. Ironically, it is the only place where she received love from her grandmother. The death of the grandmother is even mourned by the house to which she was emotionally attached. A death like silence. Here, the poetess used simile, a death like silence reigned in the house after her exit from this world. Whose exit? Grandmother's exit. It seems that the grandmother was the very soul of his house, being deserted, the snakes could be seen among books. Snakes are the reptiles. On the books which looked quite horrible and repulsive like snakes. She was almost frozen with fear at the passing away of her grandmother and seemed cold like the moon. So, the very opening lines of the poem capture alive the poetess' mood of nostalgia. She is reminded of the happiest days of her childhood, which she spent in the company of her grandmother. She was deeply attached to her grandmother, who was very caring and affectionate to her. She was emotionally destabilized after the death of her grandmother and felt almost heartbroken. The intensity of her grief is suggestively conveyed by the ellipse of the form of a few dots she has used. I received love, then dot dot dot. In the form of the few dots in this section of the poem, it was her disenchantment with her loveless marriage which reminded her of her grandmother's pure and selfless love. Think of going there to peer through blind eyes of windows or just listen to the frozen air, or in wild despair, pick an armful of darkness to bring it here to lie behind my bedroom door like a brooding dog. How often I think of going? That means she always think of going to her grandmother's place. She would like to see through the blind eyes of the windows, but she would see nothing. She may just listen through the air. She will fail to see or know anything about it because it is dark inside. In despair, she wants to pick a little darkness and bring it with her to in her bedroom door like a brooding dog. This is the literal meaning of the poem, and now what the poetess actually wants to say is she defines her relationship with her grandmother in a very moving manner. She is reminded of the happiest days of her childhood, which is spent with her grandmother. The poet was deeply attached to her grandmother, who was very caring and affectionate to her. She was emotionally shattered after the death of her grandmother, who had been the chief source of inspiration in her life. The poet often longs to visit her grandmother's house to which she was emotionally attached since her childhood. It has been a place of security and protection which is sadly missing in her new house in the city. That means in her husband's house. She would like to peep through the dust ridden and colored panes of windows which were shut after the death of her grandmother. She would like to listen and feel the still atmosphere prevailing in the house. It is this longing to revisit her grandmother's house that adds to her sense of frustration and hopelessness. The darkness of a grandmother's house can have no terrifying impact on her. She would like to gather some darkness, some memories of her grandmother's house, and bring them to her present city residence. The very memories of her grandmother's house will have a soothing impact on her loveless and hopeless married life. The poet is in a mood of reminiscence and recreates the plight of the grandmother's house after her departure from the scene of life. That means after the death of her. She gives us the very feel of the house in its state of neglect and desertion. The poetess has used the simile of brooding dog to show her inability to pay a visit to her grandmother's house. She has employed suggestive visual imagery of blind eyes of the windows and the frozen air to convey the idea of death and desperation. The last lines of the poem: You cannot believe, darling, can you, that I lived in such a house and I was proud. and loved. I who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least in a small change. That means she is not satisfied with her husband or in the house of her husband. In these lines, the poetess says how her frustration and disenchantment in the marital life forced her to go in for extramarital relationship. The poet often longs to visit her grandmother's house, to which she was emotionally attached since her childhood. Unlike her miserable city life with her husband, it had been a place of security and genuine love for her. What is that place? That place is her grandmother's house. Here, the poetess informs her dear husband that he can never believe the intensity of love that she received from her grandmother. He can never realize that she was extremely proud of her grandmother's house, where she was deeply loved by her grandmother. It is her separation from her grandmother's house after marriage that has ruined her life forever. It is loveless and hopeless married life that has crippled her sense of pride and love, which she used to have in her grandmother's house. She has become a beggar for love, who knocks helplessly at strangers' husbands' doors to receive at least in a small measure. Love in a small measure. She has almost lost her way in search of genuine and selfless love. This is all I can explain you in this poem or analyze this poem for you. In the end, I can say that Kamala Das exposes the futility of loveless and hopeless marital relationships in these 5 concluding lines of the poem. It shows the agony and humiliation of a married woman who is forced to seek extramarital relationship to seek love for her emotional satisfaction. It is the mood of nostalgia that dominates the closing phase of the poem. The poet is reminded of a grandmother's house where she received love and safety in her childhood. She lost all her identity and freedom in her loveless relationship with her husband. Other relations, except her grandmother's, are emotionally dry for her. They have no feelings and internally rotten and sterile. In the end, I can say it is a beautiful and well organized poem. The functional imagery and theme oriented diction create the desired effect of sterility, rottenness inside the heart of dancing, anxious, and environmental heat. Thank you. This is all in this poem, in this video. Thank you very much.